At first, nothing feels wrong. That's the detail history keeps repeating. Collapse never announces itself. It doesn't arrive as a shock. It arrives as continuity. Daily routines remain intact. Markets still open. Institutions still speak with confidence. Life appears functional, even familiar, and that familiarity becomes a trap. Every society that later described itself as having collapsed once believed it was simply adjusting. Small changes were framed as temporary. Structural strain was reframed as resilience. Warnings, when they existed, were softened by tradition, authority, and habit. People didn't ignore the signs. They reinterpreted them. This is where the pattern always begins. Long before systems fail, trust shifts quietly. Not trust between individuals, but trust in structures, in money, in rules, in narratives that once felt permanent. The shift is subtle. It's not fear. It's rationalization. People start explaining why things feel different while insisting that the foundation remains solid. History shows us again and again. Empires don't fall when confidence disappears. They fall when confidence becomes performative, when belief is repeated out of obligation rather than conviction, when stability is spoken aloud more often because it's felt less internally. At this stage, nothing dramatic happens. That's why it's invisible. The system still functions, but it functions differently. Rules bend quietly. Exceptions multiply. Temporary measures linger. Complexity increases, not because it's needed, but because it delays recognition. The system becomes harder to understand, and that confusion is mistaken for sophistication. This is the moment societies later struggle to identify. Looking back, historians search for a single turning point, a decision, a crisis, a failure. But from the inside, there is no clear line, only a gradual normalization of strain. People adapt. They always do. And adaptation becomes a mechanism that allows decline to continue unnoticed. What changes first is behavior, not structure. People become cautious in ways they don't articulate. Long-term thinking shortens. Trust becomes conditional. Institutions grow louder, not stronger. Language shifts. Certainty is emphasized. Doubt is framed as disloyalty. Stability becomes a talking point instead of a lived experience. This is not chaos. It's order under pressure. And pressure doesn't feel like danger when it's evenly distributed. When everyone adjusts together, no one feels alarmed. The system still works, just with more effort, more rules, more explanations, more reassurance. That effort is mistaken for progress. Every civilization that reached this phase believed it was unique, more advanced, more informed, better prepared than those before it. They studied past collapses as curiosities, not mirrors. They saw patterns as lessons already learned, not cycles still active. That belief is the most consistent feature of all, because collapse never looks like collapse while it's happening. It looks like management, like reform, like maturity, like a system proving it can handle stress. And by the time the strain becomes undeniable, the process has already done its work. The realization always comes late, not because people are foolish, but because the pattern is quiet. It doesn't demand attention. It rewards compliance, and it unfolds while everyone is busy maintaining the surface of normality. This is where the story always starts, not with panic, not with failure, but with the calm certainty that this time is different. Once a system enters this phase, the most important changes happen quietly, inside the rules themselves, not through rebellion, not through collapse, through adjustment. History shows that systems under strain don't remove their foundations. They stretch them. Laws remain. Institutions remain. Procedures remain. But their meaning shifts. What was once exceptional becomes routine. What was once temporary becomes permanent. The structure looks the same, yet behaves differently. This is where delay becomes survival strategy. Instead of resolving contradictions, societies learn to manage them. Problems aren't solved, they're absorbed. New layers are added to protect old assumptions. Complexity grows not to improve outcomes, but to prevent reckoning. And complexity works. At first, it slows the feedback loop. It makes consequences harder to trace. It buys time. Time is mistaken for stability. In past civilizations, this is a period of administrative expansion, more oversight, more regulation, more coordination. Each new rule was logical on its own. Each reform appeared necessary. But together, they formed a system that required constant intervention just to remain balanced. That balance was fragile, though invisible. The system still delivered results, but less efficiently. Small failures multiplied. Trust in outcomes weakened, even as trust in authority was publicly reaffirmed. People complied not because they believed deeply, but because noncompliance felt riskier. This is how systems preserve order long after belief begins to fade. Behavior adjusts before belief admits it has changed. People stop asking whether the system works and start asking how to navigate it. Success becomes less about contribution and more about positioning. Rules are followed carefully, not because they are respected, but because they are unpredictable. Stability becomes procedural rather than moral. This shift always feels rational. No one wakes up believing they live inside a declining structure. They believe they live inside a complicated one, a mature one that requires expertise to understand. And as understanding concentrates into fewer hands, distance grows between the system and the people it serves. That distance is crucial. In every historical case, the system becomes harder to explain precisely when it becomes more fragile. Not because leaders are malicious, but because clarity would expose contradictions that can no longer be resolved cleanly. Ambiguity becomes protective. Language becomes careful. Outcomes are reframed. Metrics replace meaning. At this stage, decline is not visible as loss. It's visible as effort. More work for the same results. More coordination for the same output. More reassurance for the same confidence. The system consumes more energy just to maintain its appearance of normal function. And because this happens gradually, it feels manageable until it doesn't. But that moment is never recognized when it matters, because adaptation masks danger. People adjust expectations downward without naming it. They call it realism, prudence, maturity, and each adjustment makes the next one easier to accept. History doesn't remember this phase clearly because it leaves few dramatic images, no singular events, no obvious villains, just a slow shift in how systems behave and how people respond to them. By the time instability becomes undeniable, the habits that sustain it are already embedded. The system has trained participants to normalize strain, to tolerate inconsistency, and to trust that someone, somewhere, understands what's happening. They always believe that, and that belief is what allows the pattern to continue quietly, long after its foundations have begun to thin. Once belief shifts from confidence to habit, the system enters its most deceptive phase. This is when warning signs are no longer resisted. They are absorbed. In earlier stages, stress creates debate. Now it creates rationalization. Signals that once would have triggered concern are reframed as normal fluctuations, temporary imbalances, or the cost of progress. The system doesn't deny problems outright. It explains them away. And explanations feel comforting. Historically, this is when societies become deeply invested in narratives of resilience, not strength, but endurance. The idea that survival itself proves legitimacy. The system may struggle, but it is still standing. That becomes the benchmark. Expectations quietly shrink. People begin to separate personal stability from systemic health. As long as daily life continues, even with friction, the system is assumed to be fundamentally sound. Discomfort is treated as external noise, not structural feedback. Individuals adapt locally. They optimize their own position. They learn workarounds. These adaptations are praised as ingenuity, even though they are symptoms of strain. The system interprets adaptation as validation. Every workaround delays confrontation. Every temporary fix becomes precedent. Over time, layers of exception replace coherent design. The structure still functions, but only because it is constantly adjusted by those inside it. This creates a dangerous illusion. Activity is mistaken for control. In past empires, this was the era of administrative genius. Skilled managers, brilliant coordinators, capable reformers. The system didn't collapse because it was neglected. It survived because it was constantly rescued. Rescue becomes routine. Eventually, the system no longer operates on principle, but on intervention. Stability depends on continuous input. Without it, imbalance spreads quickly. But because intervention works, temporarily, it reinforces the belief that intervention is enough. This is where timing becomes fatal. Early warnings lose meaning because they don't lead to immediate consequences. Each time a limit is approached and not crossed, confidence grows. The system appears elastic, flexible, capable of absorbing shocks. What's not noticed is that elasticity has a cost. Recovery leaves residue. The structure never fully returns to its previous state, but the difference is subtle. In historical accounts, this phase often appears prosperous on the surface. Trade continues. Culture flourishes. Institutions remain impressive. Yet beneath that surface, coordination becomes heavier. Decisions take longer. Responsibility diffuses. No single failure is decisive, but the margin for error narrows everywhere. People feel this before they understand it. They describe life as exhausting, complicated, fragile in ways they can't articulate. Trust becomes conditional. Optimism becomes cautious. Planning shortens. Long-term thinking gives way to immediate management. Still, no one calls it decline. Decline implies direction. This phase feels like maintenance, like holding things together. And holding things together feels responsible, necessary, even virtuous. The system rewards those who stabilize it, not those who question its trajectory. So questioning fades, not because dissent disappears, but because it feels impractical, irrelevant, dangerous. The cost of being wrong seems higher than the cost of being quiet, and silence is mistaken for consensus. History shows this clearly. Collapse is not born from ignorance. It is born from familiarity, from knowing the system so well that its flaws feel normal, from living inside strain so long that strain becomes invisible. By the time clarity returns, it is no longer useful. The system hasn't failed yet, but has already taught everyone how to live inside failure. And that lesson is rarely unlearned in time. Once a system teaches people how to live with strain, it begins to rely on that skill. What once required exceptional effort becomes routine. What once felt unsustainable becomes a new baseline. This is the phase where pressure no longer signals danger. It signals competence. Those who can function under complexity are rewarded. Those who cannot are quietly excluded. Historically, this is when inequality stops being debated and starts being explained, not justified openly, but normalized implicitly. Differences in outcome are framed as differences in adaptability. Some people navigate the system well, others don't. The system itself is no longer questioned. It becomes the environment, not a structure, like weather, and weather is endured, not challenged. Institutions respond accordingly. Policies are designed not to reduce strain, but to manage it. Relief becomes targeted, temporary, conditional. The goal is not restoration, but continuity. Keeping the machine running matters more than how it runs. This creates a subtle psychological shift. People stop expecting improvement. They hope for stability. And stability is defined narrowly. Fewer surprises, fewer shocks, fewer disruptions. Progress becomes risky. Change feels dangerous. Familiar problems feel safer than unknown solutions. In historical empires, this is when nostalgia begins to appear, not as longing for a distant past, but for a recent version of the present. a time when things were just slightly easier, slightly clearer, slightly more coherent. But that version no longer exists. The system has already consumed it. Administratively, this is the era of overlapping authorities and blurred responsibility. Power fragments without disappearing. No single actor controls outcomes, yet many influence them. Decisions are made through layers of approval, justification, and delay. Action still happens, but always late, always compromised. From the inside, this feels like caution. From the outside, it looks like drift. People sense that effort no longer correlates with outcome. Working harder doesn't guarantee security. Playing by the rules doesn't ensure fairness. The response is not rebellion, but recalibration. Expectations lower again. Horizons shrink again. Short-term thinking becomes rational. Long-term planning feels naive. The system interprets this as maturity, realism, a population that understands limits. But what's actually happening is disengagement, not withdrawal, but emotional distance. People remain inside the system, but stop investing belief in it. This is dangerous because belief is structural. In past collapses, material conditions often remain stable longer than trust. The system didn't break first. Meaning did. Rules still existed, but felt arbitrary. Authority still functioned, but felt procedural rather than legitimate. When legitimacy erodes quietly, compliance becomes mechanical. People follow rules because they must, not because they make sense. That distinction matters. It changes how stress propagates. It removes the buffer of goodwill. Small shocks now travel further. Minor failures feel personal. Injustice feels intentional, even when it isn't. The system grows brittle, without realizing it. From the inside, everything still looks organized. Charts, reports, metrics, and frameworks proliferate. Measurement increases as understanding declines. Complexity is documented, not reduced. Every problem generates analysis. Few generate resolution. This is a paradoxical calm before recognition. Not panic, not chaos, just a feeling that something essential has been lost, even if no one can name it. The system still stands. The routines still operate. Life continues, but belief no longer does. And history is consistent on this point. Once belief becomes optional, collapse is no longer an event. It becomes a process already underway. Every society believes it will recognize the moment in time. There is a comforting myth that collapse announces itself clearly, that there is a final warning, a visible turning point, a moment when everyone looks around and agrees that something fundamental has changed. History shows the opposite. Recognition is always delayed, not because people are ignorant, but because the system still works, just enough. Markets still open. Institutions still speak. Daily life still moves forward. The structure does not disappear. It thins. It hollows. It loses coherence while maintaining form. By the time the word collapse enters common language, the process is already old. What people actually notice first is not failure, but dissonance. Rules that exist but don't feel connected to reality. Effort that no longer maps to outcome. Authority that sounds procedural rather than convincing. Trust doesn't vanish overnight. It drains quietly, like water through unseen cracks. This is why every generation says the same thing. They don't say, "We didn't see it coming." They say, "It didn't look like this at first." Because it never does. The early stages feel administrative, psychological, cultural. They feel like adjustment periods, growing pains, necessary complexity. People adapt. They always do. And adaptation becomes the evidence that everything is fine, until adaptation becomes exhaustion. At that point, societies don't collapse outward. They fold inward. Participation becomes conditional. Engagement becomes selective. People comply, but stop believing. They function, but stop trusting. The system remains standing, but no longer feels shared. That is the moment history marks quietly, not with riots or ruins, but with indifference. Empires don't fall when people are angry. They fall when people stop expecting coherence, when injustice feels normal, when confusion feels permanent, when the idea of repair feels unrealistic. And every time, those living through it believe their situation is uniquely complex, more advanced, more interconnected, too sophisticated to follow the old patterns. History disagrees. Complexity has never prevented collapse. It has only delayed recognition. That delay is what defines the final phase, not the end itself, but a long period when everything necessary for collapse is already present, yet no single moment feels dramatic enough to act upon. By the time action feels justified, the system no longer responds to it. This is why societies always notice too late, not because they lacked information, but because the signal was never loud. It was structural, psychological, distributed across daily life, easy to rationalize, hard to name, and once named, impossible to reverse. If you're interested in how these patterns repeat across different eras, cultures, and systems, often in ways that feel uncomfortably familiar, consider subscribing. This channel exists to trace those quiet sequences history keeps repeating, long before the final chapter is written. Because the end is never sudden. It's recognized only in hindsight, and by then it already feels inevitable.